This is a study exploring the media challenges of the urban battlefield and how the military should respond. My name is Dr. Charles Knight and I study military operations where people live. Urban warfare is increasing and it's ugly, ethically, humanly, militarily and politically. That is evidence if you analyse media reporting of urban battles, which is what my colleague Dr. Lee Ji and I did. We looked at 6 urban battles, pairs, the First and Second Battle of Grozny, the First and Second Battle of Fallujah, and 2 incursions into the Gaza Strip. For each, we looked at reporting in 2 different newspapers from each of 4 different countries. You can see the mastheads on the slide. We analysed what was reported, the frames used to describe the events, and the rhetorical depictions. And then we compared what our analysis showed with the best historical record of actual operations. That was the core of what we did. But we did that analysis on the foundations of a lot of existing research. We looked at the relationship of the military and the media, how the military see the media as valuable and dangerous. We also looked at the research about the psychology of opinion forming. Why do we arrive at particular opinions? And the theories of how agendas are set and how information is framed in the media. And then we explored what this means for how media can influence policy, military policy in wartime. And then when we'd got our preliminary findings, we took them along and shared them with groups of journalists and military officers. And once we got their input, we distilled the key issues and made some recommendations. And then, after we completed the draft report, I had the opportunity to travel to the Philippines and study the Battle of Marawi. So we were able to use that battle as a case to validate our recommendations. In the next couple of slides, I'll highlight the key findings. First of all, we saw very clear evidence of the enormous pressure and often unrealistic expectations that contemporary military leaders are placed under in the urban battle by politicians and media. And we saw that reporting shapes what commanders actually do on the ground. And that included surprisingly frequent examples of commanders making dubious claims that they were actually progressing and succeeding when they weren't. And also, quite surprisingly, often truces are demanded and are required on the ground, usually by international political pressure. We saw that, in common with other media studies, reporting is indexed, meaning the spectrum of debate was indeed limited, as Chomsky and other critics point out. That wasn't surprising, but what we did notice that seems to be new is that journalists were more likely or freer to discuss the operational and military aspects rather than political issues. What that means is the critical power of the media often turns on the military, and military leaders get blamed for perceived failures to achieve tactical outcomes, rather than the politicians who send them there in the first place and often give very detailed restrictive directions. And it's also the case that because public debate is pulled away from the political, where the adversary is actually operating, the adversary's narrative may in fact be uncountered and be more likely to succeed. Now, there's always been tension between the journalist's desire for a story and the soldier's desire for operational security, but current information technologies make this problem much worse because reporting can have increasing real-time operational impact. Similarly, as political influence and politicians' behaviour is increasingly shaped by what we call episodic sound grab type reporting, politicians have increasing stakes in controlling military messaging. And what you've got is a shrinking pool of journalists that's really constrained or indexed by editorial guidance or limited number of outlets. And amongst that group, we encountered deep resentment and frustration with media policies. Most worryingly, we discovered that some journalists believe that the whole media military process has co-opted senior officers into a political area and therefore regarded them as compromised as a consequence. And that's really quite concerning. There's plenty of media, which sort of mentioned it before, media research that shows positive bias in journalism. Our confirmation of this pro-status quo, pro-government and pro-military bias might seem to be all to the good from the military's point of view, but in reality it creates risk. It's likely what's actually going to be portrayed in the media is a sanitized representation of battle. And that creates an unrealistic expectation of success. So you've got what's essentially a fragile picture, which is vulnerable to events that contradict the narrative. And the thing is that urban conflict can involve lots of very visible casualties. That then results in emotive, event-driven reporting that pushes through the mainstream media and the editorial agenda setting. For example, in the first Gulf War, the narrative was all about precision bombing, and then the Americans bombed a shelter in which there were many civilians were killed, and that just shattered their narrative. Alternatively, or as well as that, the new information technologies and foreign media will also have their own information streams. Either way, the public can get breakthrough news which creates unpredictable responses. So angry public responses then might be matched by the politicians themselves, or politicians may think that they have to act in response to the anger. So what you get then is impulsive political direction to change military policy, and in the case of urban conflict, it's changes of orders. And interestingly and very worryingly, that can be both towards much more aggressive actions or towards withdrawal, either which are problematic if they're changing the military operation that's underway. So from our findings, and after discussing them with expert groups, we came up with 6 recommendations. And there's some things that are needed. We need to be able to hide our own forces on the urban battlefield to make them less vulnerable to both kinetic and informational attack. We need to build public and media understanding of the acute difficulties of urban combat. Our own forces need to be able to generate a compelling media product that can win the battle of the narratives. We need solid, well-validated doctrine that's thoroughly understood, not just by the military, but by the politicians, so the pressure to suddenly change the way you're doing things is more easily resisted. We need military capabilities that reduce military casualties and civilian casualties, but particularly reduce own casualties, so the reliance on firepower to keep your own soldiers safe is not so great. And last but not least, we need a major effort to improve military to media relations, and ideally perhaps we should be trying to integrate journalists within the military system so that they provide some level of oversight and assurance of behaviour, and we discussed that. Very fortunately, we were able to run these recommendations past my case study of the Battle of Marawi, and from that I'm fairly well assured that those recommendations align with the practices developed or the lessons learned by the Filipinos. Above all, Lieutenant General Bautista, who was in command at the time, emphasised what he called the soft power battle was at least half the struggle. If they hadn't won the battle of the narratives about urban war, it's likely that insurgency would have spread right across the island of Mindanao. The point is that in urban war, the media are increasingly going to affect the strategic outcome, and armies have to respond to that.
I'm Kate Carter from the Australian Defence College in Australia. We're very happy to be here and welcome everyone who is watching this tonight. With me I have Charles Knight from Charles Sturt University and Catherine Manstead from the National Security College at the Australian National University. Welcome everybody. And tonight we're going to be talking about Charles's paper and talking about the decisive role of media on the urban battlefield. So Charles, can I just start by bringing out an observation that I have made, which is when we talk about information, media and information operations in maybe conventional warfare, there's a real distinction between what we might traditionally call psychological operations, PSYOPs, and information operations, and PR and education. In the urban battlefield, there's a lot more stakeholders. So I wonder what you think are the lines. Perhaps these areas now get blurred a bit. So where do you see the lines falling between PSYOP, information operations, PR and education?
Look, I think you put your finger on it. The lines really are blurred. And if we look at the Battle of Marawi, the Philippine military went across all those lines. So they brought back in the idea of the combat photographers, because those were the only people that they had to do it themselves because nobody could, or the journalists couldn't get out there and record. They created their own social media unit for getting into the social media, iPhone space, and they engaged and to the degree that they could, co-opted the national media. All those things are blurred because, as you say, everybody's in the space. So you've got ugly things happening, casualties happening, get people attention. You've got people there who've got devices that allow them to record, and you've got the journalists all in close proximity with each other.
One question I have when we're thinking about using your case study in the paper was around the Philippines. What distinctions would you draw between, I mean, it sounds like the Philippines did a pretty good job in that instance of picking up social media, for instance. Western militaries are famously quite bad at using social media. I think of an example from my domain, US Cyber Command wanted to put out a meme attributing bad cyber actions to Russia. This meme was a behemoth. It cost a lot of money. A lot of people spent a lot of days doing it. The meme was trash. No one shared it on social media, maybe 1,000 shares, which, that's hardly the stuff of virality. How do you assess Western, and that's a contested term I know, but kind of Australian, Anglo, European militaries' capacity to engage here?
I heard a lot of criticism, particularly before I travelled, of the Philippines military. And setting aside the tactical component, they really did the soft power thing well. And if there was one thing that distinguished them, is they do what we claim to do, which is mission command and delegation. So to get a minor meme approved in the Australian Defence Force or the British Army, it's a brigadier signing off if you're lucky. What they did was they got their 80 people, they just finished their social media course. They said, you're not going back to your units, you're going to Marawi. They put them in a warehouse and put them on shifts. And then they said, guys, get on the net, do the job. You're Philippine soldiers, do whatever it takes to take down the messaging of the other side. Now, it's a slightly more robust system. If you were to stray too far within the Philippine military, it wouldn't be good. But that level of trust was massive.
That makes me question, though, where's this balance between OPSEC, operational security, and good education of public at home about what's happening, what the government messages are, and what the military actions are? How do you strike that balance between secrecy and information?
It shouldn't be too hard. The idea of embedded reporters is been quite well proven. And in fact, Chomsky and many of the people on that part of the spectrum really criticize embedding because it co-opts the military. But more obviously, if you're in battle with the military, you aren't going to compromise operational information because you're going to die as well. So, but you've got this really strange thing that, particularly the ADF, are anxious about what the media might say, so they push them away. So they actually put them to a distance where they'll be more critical, which is, you know, and that's strange, because we can compare the Americans who've done that rather better.
And Catherine, I wonder if you observe this too, that if the military isn't giving out information, then there's a bit of an information vacuum. So sometimes we see the media, you know, doing all sorts of creative reporting to fill that vacuum with information. If there is an information vacuum in a battle, what do you think the role of the media is then? What should they be doing?
Well, I mean, this is an interesting question, and one I wanted to take up with you as well, Charles, because we are assuming that the media, and I know you don't in your report, but there is a tendency to assume the media is monolithic or nation state based, and in a contested urban environment where you also have a contested information space. We live in the age of disinformation and deception. It won't just be the Australian media or allied media on the ground there. It'll be a whole range of people competing for that narrative, competing for that story. So there is a really interesting question about the extent to which you want to support your national media to tell a particular story, even if you don't 100% like that story, telling some story based in trust and based in the ethics of a journalistic system that you can trust, to me would seem to be important, even if it's not perfectly controlled as the military would want it to be.
So maybe controlling the narrative isn't the aim. It's just to what? To
don't leave a
influence it?
vacuum. Don't leave a vacuum. And education, I think, is a key point, that, you know, giving those skills before conflict, pre-narrative, but skilling up journalists to be able to tell an authentic story. I guess that has to start now, not during a period of context.
No, exactly. And unfortunately, we've got fewer and fewer journalists who specialise even in the military or security, much less in so to answer to Kate's question there, what should be happening if there's a media vacuum? Well, they could be anticipating the nature of the battle with historical references. I'm talking about, these are the previous battles and this is what's happened. And by the way, in urban conflicts, invariably you will get civilian casualties, invariably you'll get bone casualties. All these things are normal, so therefore, or usual. It is not evidence of failure that those things occur. That you can frame that. But the other element is that, you know, the military need to get on the front foot and drive the narrative and do what the Filipinos do, which is put helmet cameras on the soldiers and have real-time information. So you are offering the media vision. And yes, there's the dilemma for the media as to whether they want to be used by it. But if you've got the most compelling stories, it is more likely that your narrative will prevail.
This is a broader question, I suppose. So from my perspective, looking across national security writ large, as opposed to just kind of military affairs, this is a broader and hotly contested debate in Australia right now. Last year, we had a Senate inquiry by our Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security into the relationship between national security and media reporting, and this so-called balance between secrecy on the one hand and media freedoms on the other. And before that committee, one of the points that I made was, you know, this is not necessarily just a balance between freedom, journalistic freedom on the one hand and secrecy on the other. There's actually, the national security community has a stake in freedom and in information, because if you create that vacuum, someone else will fill it. And if you don't upskill your journalists through time to be able to deal with these complex issues, when you get to a contested environment, your story won't be told. And it's better to tell a story that's 80% of the way there, rather than no story at all, I would argue.
Look, it's an age-old problem. So when the first reporting came out of the Crimea, which ultimately led to major reforms of the British Army, you know, the reporter in question was hounded. Murdoch, the story Gallipoli took a different direction because an Australian reporter, one of the earlier Murdochs, sneaked a letter out saying what was really going on. So there are long antecedents about the importance of free media, or at least critical media. And it's part of the argument in long campaigns that democracy is supposed to prevail because there is a process. But as we adjust to a different media environment, and one where reporting is increasingly sound grabs. I mean, technically it's episodic rather than thematic reporting. So politicians know they just want a short, sharp, simple message, and they're putting that out, and they don't want anything else out. And I think it's probably worth saying that, you know, in this space, the defence don't look good in terms of the way they engage the media. But ultimately, we have a system where the minister of the day says what will and won't go. And fairly frequently, the minister of the day will say, you're not going to talk about whatever it is. Now, that is seen to reflect on the senior officers of the Defence Force. That's totally in fact. They have to get on with whatever they're told to do. And what compounds it isn't, by and large, all the ministers I've ever talked to seem pretty sensible, but they're surrounded with a bunch of very bright young people in the 20s who are highly skilled in media relations, but don't know much about the topic, and they will, unsurprisingly, always caution, and that's limited.
I'm just thinking about the idea of live streaming battle. You know, the kind of fashion that we've got into now of putting body cams and helmet cams on all sorts of people, you know, whether they're emergency services people or law enforcement or soldiers. And it's for a whole lot of different reasons too, accountability and litigation mainly. But if you are kind of streaming images from battles via soldiers into people's lounge rooms, is there a danger that you'll end up with a whole lot of armchair warriors and people who become instant experts on what's happening, and maybe you don't have an informed narrative of what's happening in the battle, but you have interpretations by people of what's, people at home, if you like, what's going on?
Look, absolutely, that's a danger, and as long as we continue to not have informed thematic analysis of what's being portrayed, that's always going to be a risk. But the challenge now is that there is a battle of the narratives, and the people who are opposing us are pretty damn good at it. And ISIS, Daesh, in particular, have mastered the art of putting brutal material out that just cuts through. And the question then is, how do we compete with that? And we're really on the back foot for all kinds of good reasons in the Australian Defence Force. As soon as there's a casualty somewhere in an operational area, all communications close down until that person's family had been notified. And that's reasonable on the surface. First of all, it signals to all the families back in Australia exactly that somebody's been hurt. But so if we are taking up to a day, maybe more, to inform somebody, the next of kin, and the opposition are putting an image of the dead Australian service person out within minutes, the narrative's already taken a completely different trajectory. So the question is, can we afford to continue to manage it the way we do? What do we do when we get a news feed, or a feed comes from somewhere else on the planet with the person's name in 3 minutes after they've died? And this isn't academic. If we look at what was going on in the Donbass, there were cases of people picking combatants picking up a phone and phoning the relatives of the people who are on the phone and telling them that the person's just been killed. So, I mean, there are absolutely combatants out there prepared to do that.
So maybe this brings me into the myth of casualty threshold, and whether there is a casualty threshold, or whether there's some other kind of influences that call for populations to either stop the war and come home, bring everyone home, or whether it kind of makes the country rise in their resolve and a determined effort to sort of finish the job. Does media have a role in maybe determining where that casualty threshold is?
My sort of fundamental thesis with this report is that you have got a volatility, you've got a fragility. Stories will come into the public domain, get into the political process, and have entirely unpredictable consequences if they are not managed. So absolutely, the media are part of that process. But what this report says is, militaries need to be cognizant of it and decide how you are going to manage this. Because, as an example, this very essentially similar events can have very different consequences. Now, you may recall back in the last century, in Somalia, some dead American soldiers were dragged through the streets, and it was surrounding Black Hawk Down and a bigger incident. But at the end of the day, American public opinion shifted, and the Americans withdrew from what was essentially a benign operation in Somalia. Go to the other extreme in 2004, when 4 American contractors are ambushed. They're in the wrong place at the wrong time, not being basic incompetence involved in the whole thing. They're killed, not particularly distinguishable from a lot of American servicemen being killed, but their bodies are then taken, burned and hung on a bridge. And that imagery just turns the American polity on its head. And you had the bizarre situation within a couple of days. You had ultimately the White House saying, you will go and pacify that city, and the Major General Conway, the Marine commander on the ground, going, no, it's not a really good idea. But my point here is volatility works either way. So all, with whatever size of politics you're on, you've got to be conscious of this issue.
I think you make the point in your report as well that technologies close the gap between the politicians and the battlefield. So they do have that ability to step into the breach and make decisions for I guess political reasons, or also kind of strategic decisions about this will look good, this will sell well, which might be in tension with what is operationally the best decision at that point in time. But the other thing I wanted to surface, which kind of gets to your question, Kate, is I think there is an assumption when we talk about future wars sometimes to think that they will be more transparent, to think that there will be more information available. And I wonder if that is a bit of a faulty assumption. We're thinking about, yes, I think in a future battle space, the world will be awash with information. And yes, it's key to educate media on what urban ops might look like. But isn't it also important to educate both the media and the public on how to deal with information volatility, information overload, and to accept that whatever you're seeing might not be the truth? Whatever kind of powerful imagery you're seeing, or whatever vignette you're seeing in the broader context, given the fog of war, might actually not be the truth. And how do you bridge that gap?
Look, absolutely, because we see it, often in conventional reporting. There's a headline and it's scandalous, and then 4 days later there's a retraction. We don't see the retraction. So if you during World War II, is get the message out. If you're out there with the story first, that has an influence. I mean, I've seen some studies recently. They say when false information is put out and it is consumed by the public, even when they know it is false, it still has some biasing effect. So absolutely, we need to, because part of the game here will be to falsely represent what the other side's doing, particularly in the urban environment. So we have some casualties. We represent them in a particular way. Now, it's controversial, but the gas attack in Douma in Syria arouses even amongst the specialists, some strong claims which way. The point is, it's not clear. I'm not taking a position on which way, and that probably wasn't initially an information operation from the start. So if you've got an information operation from the start generating something completely false, very difficult to see how media are going to. What's the answer? Well, if there's no one answer, but if you have a trusted media source where the public will go and go, yeah, broadly I trust that organisation, that's enormously important. But it goes back to, well, the military need to have that relationship, and they have to be genuinely trusted by the media also. So it's absolutely, it strikes me as absolutely central. Although whether it's possible to reach that level of trust anymore, I don't know. If we look at, say, the criticism of the ABC or the BBC in the UK, they're assumed by polarised communities to have a contrary view.
Well, perhaps it's no surprise that there's a recent report out by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute that looks at the way in which the BBC has come under concerted attack from Chinese Communist Party disinformation campaigns. It's perhaps no surprised that some of these main media outlets for democracies can be the target of nation state information operations, even in peacetime, let alone, I imagine, during a time of contest when their trust and authenticity would be right in the crosshairs.
And on that, I think when we're thinking about you know, the duration of battle, let's say, and the nightly story that kind of loses a bit of emphasis after the first couple of days. And then there's some other story that might take over, particularly a more domestic one, one that has immediacy for the people at home. Then I think, and I saw this, I think, in the second Gulf War, that the kind of live streaming effect, the information overload was such that people lost interest. So even, you know, if you take that, perhaps the battle is going to be reported on in a soundbite, then that the trust in the media is going to be weighed up against the trust in the media reporting everything else in the news. And so, you know, if the media are reporting on healthcare or on infrastructure, then if there's a kind of, you know, general trust in the media reporting that right or misreporting that, then that's going to go over to the, you know, reporting of the battle as well, even though it might be completely different sets of people and networks and that sort of thing. So I think, you know, people will see the media in general as reporting in a trustworthy way. And if they start to go off, then, you know, the battle, if you like, the information battle will be lost for the war. So it's in the, you know, it might be the biggest thing for the generals at the time, but to the public, it's just one news item in the nightly news. So, yeah, it's kind of contextualized there.
From an ethics perspective, what are both of your senses on where we should draw the boundaries or the lines between what we will and won't do? So we talked about kind of ISIS being really good at putting horrific imagery out, getting in that 24/7 news cycle. Should we play that game of live streaming, getting information out quickly, or do we need to hold ground and in some way be a little bit more sober and not, you know, I'm thinking about the Kantian kind of edict not to treat people as means to an end, but as an end in themselves. And if we are using imagery and footage of casualties or footage of events, are we kind of using the battle or soldiers as kind of means to an end, as opposed to being more respectful? And how does that even manifest when you're in a situation of contest? Are there some things that you are prepared to do that you wouldn't have done before?
Well, I think then the media becomes like any other sort of weapon or means of you know, winning effects in battle, that you apply the same principles of proportionality and discrimination to how you present information. You know, the information can have the same risks as we've just identified of, you know, of turning public support against you, of you know, not being discriminatory and perhaps you know, reporting things that that are unnecessary and would cause harm in the reporting of them, of revealing operational security, and perhaps of looking as though it's a kind of revenge move. So I think you know, if you use information as another military tactic, then you apply the same principle that you do in war. Do you think there are different rules, or?
I mean, my immediate reaction was, well, we're quite happy to sacrifice women's lives. That's central to what we're doing. So that's the reference point. This is one for public debate ultimately, because it's clear that there is there are narrative wars, and you talked about the Chinese, but the Chinese are absolutely playing in the space. So the question: Do we want to engage? The answer is we don't really have a choice. But the question is, to what level do we engage? And I'm saying here, as well, this report, we need to look really hard at it, and we at the very least need the capability of having the better story. And I mean, one can imagine how that physically can be done, and it's, you know, the helmet cameras are downloaded, and then an organisation whose job it is to look at the operational implications and all of those things. But I mean, that is all technically possible. Do we want to engage in that? But what I'm also saying is there's some other things we need to do, and that is to conceal the battlefield, primarily because we want to stop other people putting aim fire on our soldiers. But the incidental effect of obscuring a battlefield will also be to conceal all of this. That creates a different issue as to whether we're then accused of, you're just smoking the battlefield to conceal the bad stuff you're doing. And it comes back to what do you need to do to be believed? And you know, in World War II, it's pretty clear that the policy of the BBC was to not tell all the truth, but always tell the truth when it was true. And there were very few exceptions, which they did use strategically. And you can see that even in the Falklands, when the Prime Minister's really angry with the BBC because the BBC won't say our troops. But it's trying to adhere to this principle of being trusted. But can we still achieve that? And one of the questions I'd ask is whether, if public broadcasting can't do that, do the military themselves actually need their own broadcasting agency where people would say, well, we know you've got a particular angle, but at least we know what it is. I don't know.
That's a proposal, like going back into the 1990s when John Aquila was first writing about information warfare. He had this kind of neat idea of we need special media forces, the ability to be able to parachute someone into contested territory and get the ground truth. And that idea has always appealed to me because I think when we're thinking about urban operations, for instance, it's not just necessarily situations where our troops are involved. It might be more of these hybrid situations where you might have elements of organised crime being involved. You might have, you know, mercenary thugs in certain elements, particularly earlier on in a conflict. How do you actually get out the ground truth about what they're doing, who has sponsored them, and why? And I do wonder if we need to think about the way in which the military itself prioritises truth and fact gathering.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in '99 when East Timor was a mess, and I was in the headquarters somewhere, and we were speculating about what the tools we needed might be, and yeah, drones were something that had been invented. We just didn't really have them, and there was very much that thought that if those who were being seen as the victims at the time were able to put the imagery out, that would be very powerful. But we're absolutely in the realm of politics, and you know what should or should not the military be pushing? I don't. It's problematic. The Australian Army had a survey of how well they were doing in Afghanistan, and it was a good idea that they were sort of monitoring the public opinion. But one of the questions was, you know, do you approve of the Australian Army being in Afghanistan? And you go, hang on, that's actually a political question. And if you are trying to get that answer in the affirmative, I'm not suggesting there was actually a plan behind, then you're absolutely in the political domain. But there again, if you're in an insurgency, it is all about the effect on the domestic population and the will to sustain. So where are these boundaries? And I get the issue is these issues need to be in the public domain, in the public debate.
So what grand questions are you left with then after your study, Charles? And what should we all be thinking about in terms of media, particularly in the urban terrain?
Well, first of all, it's building an understanding of this conflict and the brutal, ugly nature of it. The fact that the cameras are there, the people are there. It's exposing a reality, and that reality is likely to cascade out from time to time in an uncontrollable way. And we need, if points along the journey of that information aren't educated, then it can have very ugly consequences when it hits the political. As you were saying earlier, the politicians may look at that, they hear very quickly, and there's this assumption, so there's presumed influence. The politicians presume that the public will act in a particular way, and therefore, so above all, I guess the word's education. It's about having the military having their own capabilities to play in the space. Military actually being better at this sort of a fight, so that they have equipment for this sort of fight and thoroughly trained for this sort of fight, so that they are less likely to resort to high levels of firepower to save the soldiers. But above all, understanding it.
Yeah. Well, I hope that leaves everyone with some really interesting discussions to have, particularly in terms of new, ethical ways of thinking and prosecuting the battle in the urban terrain. Much more complicated. Every battle that goes on, and more questions are raised. So, thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
And thank you, Catherine.
Thank you both.
And I hope everyone enjoys reading The Realities of War, Recognising and Planning for the Decisive Role of Media on the Urban Battlefield. And I hope you enjoy the conference. We're sorry we can't be there, perhaps next year, but this is a time where we can all just share in this information, across the waters. So thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the conference.